This episode was a doozy, and the way it went was unexpected, to say the least. But I think it may be one of the most helpful episodes that we've ever aired. At the same time, it's uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable for you to watch at times. It was uncomfortable for me in the moment and to rewatch. And I need to give you this warning. If you have been through spiritual abuse or you've been through significant church hurt that involved any kind of narcissism, gaslighting, narcissistic responses, this episode could be very triggering for you. So if you need to take a break, if you need to step away at any point, feel free to do that. Your own mental health, your own spiritual health comes first. But I want to encourage you to work through this episode if you can, even if it takes a little while. Because in this episode, a couple of kind of weird and frustrating things happened. But again, I think they can help you. And the more they trigger you, the more helpful they may be. So again, take it at your own pace, but I encourage you try to get through it if you can. Because in today's episode, we talked to a local church pastor in Alabama who I met online. Now, full disclosure, I knew about this pastor and his church before we met online. And before we met online, I had only heard phenomenal things about him and his church. Really, really good things. He was not on my radar. His church was not on my radar until he started commenting on social media. There was a lot of criticism, a lot of comments where we disagreed with each other. Again, he was much better than a lot of pastors as far as his responses. We get into that at the beginning of this episode. But he was very critical, and we have disagreed on most everything in those comments. It was on TikTok. It was on Instagram. It was across platforms. It was across posts. And I've invited him multiple times to go into a deeper conversation. Finally, very clearly invited him to the podcast. And to my surprise, he said yes. And I'm so grateful that he said yes. This person, Jerry Lawson, the pastor of Daystar Church in Coleman, Alabama, there's a lot of good things he says even in this podcast episode. There's a lot of good things his church does. So I want to be very clear. Even though this episode goes a little wonky and I'm going to point out some really tough things, it's going to be tough for him to watch. It's going to be tough for people who believe in him to watch because there's going to be uncomfortable things there. I want to be very clear. I think there's a lot of good things to Jerry Lawson. I think there's a lot of good things that are happening at Daystar Church. Okay, so we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're not saying this is an unhealthy church or anything like that. We're not saying it's a dangerous church. We're saying in this episode, in this conversation, you're going to see some conversational red flags that happen in churches a lot. And if you've experienced this, that's why it could be very triggering for you, because you're going to experience some things that make you feel a certain way. They're going to put you back in that place, maybe in uncomfortable conversations that you had with church leaders in the past. And to be completely candid, there are a lot of responses that he uses, a lot of tactics he uses in this conversation that are very narcissistic. Now, in the conversation, I say that to him, and I make it very clear I am not calling him a narcissist. I'm not diagnosing anyone. We don't diagnose anyone. Most people who exhibit narcissistic behavior are not narcissists. They don't have NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. And as we talked about on a lot of other episodes, and I'll link some right here so that you can get to those and check those out. We're also going to do more episodes on this in the future. But we've talked to narcissism experts and everything else. And one thing that we say often, we are all on the narcissism spectrum, okay? Every single one of us is on the narcissism spectrum. So just because a person has narcissistic behaviors does not make them a narcissist. But one of the things, and I love this, narcissism expert Ramani Diversala, she says it this way. She says, we've got to be able to separate narcissistic behavior from the backstory. We've got to stop explaining away a person's bad behavior or potentially dangerous, manipulative, or controlling behavior simply because of their backstory or the reasons why they say they're doing this. So again, when we look at this in this episode, there's going to be a lot of narcissistic responses that church leaders use often in environments that are potentially dangerous, potentially unhealthy. A lot of pastors don't know they're doing it. And I'm going to go ahead and give the benefit of the doubt. I don't think Jerry knew everything that he was doing. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't think he was doing these things purposefully to hurt anyone, but he did them enough that they seem to be go-to responses for him. Okay, that happens with a lot of pastors. They don't know that the responses that they're giving are narcissistic. They don't know that the responses they're giving could cause trauma triggers in any sort of traumatized population. And that's why the work we do with Church Safe Assessments, part of what we do is we do trauma-informed training with church staffs. Because once you understand how certain things, the ways of saying certain things that people present, ways of presenting things, once you realize how it can affect people who have experienced trauma, you talk different, you act different. And once we've been trained in those things, it becomes very easy to be intentional and not do things that could re-traumatize people. Now, I'm also going to say this. For those who haven't been through any sort of trauma, you may look at some of this and say, Jeff, you're making a big deal out of nothing. But as someone who has PTSD, who has those trauma triggers, I'm going to be very honest as I know how to be. This was the most triggering interview I've ever done. And I struggled. There's also about a 3 to 5 minute section in this that, hey, I need to repent of. I need to apologize for, because while it doesn't come across as bad as I thought it did, I didn't yell as loud as I thought I did. I really don't even think it comes across as yelling in the recording. I felt like I was yelling in the moment, and I think Jerry felt like I was yelling at him as well. Totally get that. I need to repent because I let my anger and my triggers control me in that moment. And what that taught me doesn't mean I'm a bad person, doesn't mean that Jerry's a bad person. What it means is that things that Jerry said still triggered some of the trauma that I have. And it was a reminder to me, there are places where I thought I'd experienced healing, where I still need to work through things, work through my trauma, and get better. So I want to own up to that before we get started. There was a part where I kind of had enough, and I let my anger control me in a way that wasn't godly, in a way that wasn't peaceful. The only good thing that came out of it is you will see the tone and tenor of the conversation change after I set some really hard boundaries in that moment. And that's the thing, when you're dealing with people who exhibit narcissistic behaviors, again, they may not be narcissists, but in the moment, they are exhibiting narcissistic behaviors. When you deal with that, especially in church environments, one of the only ways that a lot of times you're going to be able to get back control, if you can, is to set hard boundaries and to let them know you're not going to be ran over. Now, the problem is, while I could do that in this interview with Jerry, because I don't go to his church and he's not a spiritual authority over me, that is next to impossible to do, very difficult to do in churches where a pastor or leader has authority over you, because once you do that and you show them that you can't be controlled, a lot of times isolation tactics are going to come into play, feeling like you're being punished, being labeled as someone who's divisive. All of those things can come into play. And I know that a lot of you who are listening, you've experienced that. So again, this is a long intro, and the reason why it's so long, I wanted you to know this episode is different than any other episode that we've done. When you look at, there's a lot of things I'm going to have to insert into this episode because I realized probably about midway through that if I responded and had a conversation with Jerry the way that I do all of our other guests so far, that it was not going to go well. We weren't going to get very far. So I just began to let him talk more and more and more. So I'm going to give some feedback here that I wasn't able to give in the interview because it wasn't going very well. But what we're going to do in this interview that is going to be different than any others that we've ever done, we're going to use some of the red flag review editing that we're going to be doing in church red flag reviews soon. And you're going to start seeing those come out this month, our red flag reviews of churches, where we show, hey, here's the things that you can look for that are green flags, red flags, yellow flags in potential churches just off of their website if you've been through trauma. Because if you've been through trauma, it doesn't matter if a church is healthy or not. What matters is that you put yourself in a position where you're least likely to be hurt again. Because once you've been hurt in church and you've experienced trauma, you don't want to experience another trauma again, right? So here's some of the editing things that you are going to see. You're going to see in some places some green flags. When Jerry says something that I'm like, hey, that is spot on, that is healthy, and regardless of our disagreements, you need to know that was really, really good. I tried to put some of those in there because, again, we're not dehumanizing anyone. I believe that Jerry loves Jesus and he loves the local church. And even though we disagree on a lot, and I think his responses are the kind of potentially dangerous responses we see too often from church leaders, there's still so much good there. So there are going to be some green flags. Don't let your disagreements with a person or your frustrations with a person make you write them off completely, okay? You're going to see a lot of red flags, and there's a different noise for green flags and red flags, okay? You're going to get an error noise with the red flags. You're going to get a ding of a bell with the green flags. The red flags are predominantly when we see what I would recognize as a narcissistic response, okay? A response that is dangerous for someone who's experienced trauma, or a response that is designed to control, to manipulate, to dismiss someone's feelings, to shut down an argument. Any kind of responses like that are going to come with a red flag. And there are a few red flags where I would just say, hey, I think this is the wrong view, like a really wrong view or a potentially dangerous view of the church. We don't give a red flag for every disagreement. We're going to focus mainly on what I would say are potentially dangerous responses, okay? So those are going to be the red flags. And then you're going to hear another noise that sounds a little bit like this. It's just a muted noise. You're going to hear that most of the times where there was intentional interruption and disruption, where this guest tried to take back control. And the only reason why we did that is because in situations like this, when you're dealing with narcissistic behavior from a church leader, you're often going to run into that because there is a fight. There is a struggle for control. So I'm just going to show you that. Now, I'm not completely blameless in this. I always interrupt some of our guests, and we talk about that. Interruption in conversation is not always bad. I think you're going to see the difference here, though. But I did start interrupting him part of the way through because it was, hey, there's just certain places we're going to go and we're not going to go. But when I separated the audio out from these, there was a massive difference. I believe it was about 3/4 of the time total that Jerry talked versus me talking. So again, I'm going to interject a lot of thoughts in this one. This is going to be a longer episode. You can watch it in multiple sittings if you need to, but I'm going to interject those thoughts so that you can see after the conversation, after I was able to, hey, breathe a little bit, get some perspective, talk to some experts in these different arenas, and really just get wisdom from other Christ followers who understand mental health. I want to let you know where I was at, where I wish I had worked differently, and I want you to see why these things are so dangerous and damaging at times, why they will trigger people who have been through trauma in the way that they do. So I hope that is helpful. I hope this episode is helpful. And again, just different than any that we've ever done. This is not an episode that I want to do one like again, but we're going to keep talking to pastors we disagree with because most of the time they're really good. From our interview with TJ Malden, fantastic interview if you want to go watch that one. Our interview with Lauren Hildebrandt, we didn't agree on everything. Again, both of those guys were critical of us at times. Yeah, that was a fantastic episode. And our most recent episode interview with the pastor, Cody Ferris, I thought was a really good episode. So we're going to continue talking to local church pastors who are critical of some of our takes, who don't agree with us, because we want to see a healthy church. And it's a good reminder that even when we've experienced damaging and hurtful expressions in the church, it doesn't mean that the best answer is for us to run away from the church. Just like in this situation, we experienced a bad interview with a pastor. I'm not going to let it keep us from having good interviews with other pastors, because most of our interviews, even with critics, turn out to be very life-giving and helpful to everyone involved. They're life-giving to the church. So anyway, the longest intro we have ever done to set this up. I hope that this interview actually, that it fits true and you see it's true to the things that I'm saying, how I'm setting it up. But without further ado, let's get into my interview with Jerry Lawson of Daystar Church. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And I am interested in today's conversation to see where it goes. I think it's going to be helpful. I think this is going to be a different one. We have invited a couple of pastors in the past who have been critical of the podcast. But today I would say we're inviting a pastor who's probably been the most critical of the podcast. And, across platforms, we've had some different comments, some different conversations. The good news is this isn't a pastor who's cursed at us. This isn't a pastor who's totally lost his mind and, lost his witness. We've had some of those. But the reason why I say this is one of the most critical pastors that we've had is simply, I don't think we've agreed on much of anything yet. And you can, correct me here in just a minute, Jerry, if I'm wrong. But I think for the most part, we have disagreed. Whereas with some of the other critical pastors, they've been hypercritical about certain aspects, but we've agreed at least on others. But from the beginning, we wanted this conversation, this podcast, to be more about conversation than consensus. So I think there's something we definitely got to learn today. And I'm always grateful when people are willing to join hard and uncomfortable conversations for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of protecting people, and for the sake of growing healthier churches. So today we welcome on the podcast Pastor Jerry Lawson. Jerry is the lead pastor of Daystar Church in Coleman, Alabama. I am not sure how many of you guys are running now, but I know you're one of the larger churches in Alabama. And full disclosure, Jerry, before I connected with you on social media, because we've had some fairly tense exchanges, I've only heard good things about your church. I actually had a very positive viewpoint of you before I ever met you on social media. I know some people who go to your church. I once served under a pastor who knew you. I've served in Eufaula, Alabama for years in ministry. So I've only heard good things. And my hope and my prayer has always been that those things are very true, because it sounds like you guys are doing some really good stuff in Coleman. But Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today. I probably did a poor job of telling people who you are. Why don't you take a couple of minutes and just let our audience know a little bit about who you are, what you do day to day, and why you wanted to come on the podcast?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm the founding pastor of what was a really small church in a really, really small town. We started in a town of 491 people, and we were adjacent to the big city, which had 14,000 people. So really small community. And I've been married to the same woman for 30 years, my only wife. Got 3 kids, and we started this church. And we're just blown away by God's blessing, how it's gone for us. I was a little surprised at my intro there, Jeff, just a minute, that I was the most I was the number one
Critical,
dissenter of your podcast. Hearing also that some others have cursed you out, so that puts me in a pretty rough spot. I don't curse people out.
I didn't say you were the meanest. Let's just be clear. I didn't say you were the meanest by far. I wanted to make sure that people knew that for the most part, you kept your integrity, I think, in all of this. And when I say for the most part, it's just because I don't have all the comments in front of me. I don't remember a time where you lost your integrity. A lot of pastors lose their integrity with us, but they also agree on some things. They may be less critical, but they're way more mean-spirited about it. And you have had I think at least still a lot of grace to your spirit, which I've appreciated.
Yeah, and really for me, Jeff, just to get right to why we have some conflict, is words matter. And how you say words, like the way I put that together, that like I've been the most critical, and then you've had some who've like cursed you out, and then when you said, for the most part, I've kept my integrity, man, I feel like I've kept my integrity for the last 30 years. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so I haven't for the most part kept my integrity. Like, that's a non-negotiable for me. Like, I don't ever, there's nowhere I go that I, for the most part, keep my integrity. And so those are like just red flashing lights for me. Language matters. How you say words matters. The words you say matter. So yeah. I have my only, really, like most of what you're pointing out about the mistakes and the major problems in the church, I was thinking about it this morning. Like, it's the thing I built my church on. My church is built on me pushing back on the same issues you're pushing back on. So like what you're talking about, I am all for. I just feel like sometimes you're a little bit loose with the language, and you're not specific enough with some of the characterizations that you offer. Like, your characterizations are very, very true of a lot of people, but it sounds like it's true of all the people. And to me, that's a very important distinction. And that's really the majority of any pushback I've given you is like choose those words more carefully and don't say mega churches do this, say some mega churches do this, because then you're lumping in like a lot of people who don't do, what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, we've had this conversation. We had this similar conversation with TJ Malden, because I agree words do matter. As an author of multiple books, as a ghostwriter, as a professional writer and communicator, I definitely understand that words matter. It's one of those things, a lot of people tend to put assumption into words, Jerry. So this is one of the things I always ask is when we're talking about words, where they matter, specific posts, things like that. I always just ask people, hey, was what I said untrue? Okay, if it's not untrue, then what bothered you about it? And a lot of times it's we put our assumptions on both sides into it. Now that we can't help with. So again, one of the things we try to pin it up on all the social media accounts. We've got different posts that we made, and we make them regularly, that we can't offer full context of 90-minute conversations, 2-hour conversations in a reel or a short. So these are invitations to a greater conversation. We try not to clip things to make them out of context, but we can't put the full context in there. So we're always pointing people back to those full episodes, right? So when we started this conversation, and this is for our listeners who don't pay attention to the comments because it can be a toxic place sometimes. This is how I normally have those conversations with people as well. So somebody will say, hey, I don't like that word choice there. The first question is, was it untrue? Did we say something untrue? Help me see that. Because if we did, then we're going to fix that. If we didn't say something untrue and you just don't like the way the word was understood, or you think people may misunderstand it, there's a lot of assumption that goes into that we can't fix. So the next question I'll ask is, hey, have you watched the conversation? Have you watched the conversation? We'll even give them timestamps so where they can find that part of the conversation. Because I'm not sure how we can do it without clipping things up, without putting in, nuances, without, saying, hey, we got to put in this 15-minute clip to explain the context on this one clip. I'm not sure how we could even do that a lot of times. What we're after is starting these conversations. But let's go back to the example that you gave when I said you were probably the most critical pastor that we've had online.
No, you said I was the most. You said I was, not probably. You said I was the most.
All right. So you're the most critical pastor that I remember online. Okay. Right. But today I would say we're inviting a pastor who's probably been the most critical of the podcast, and probably been the most critical of the podcast.
Words matter. Language matters. How you say words matters. The words you say matter. So
what does critical mean? I think you had been critical. I think you would agree to that. I think that is the term.
I have, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep. So there's nothing untrue about that. When I mentioned that people, that you haven't, acted like other people who have cussed me out and everything else, that was an attempt to add context so that people would see that your heart is different than a lot of the critics, that you carry yourself different than a lot of the critics. That was an attempt to actually, show people that you're different in a more positive way. But in that attempt to add context, that's actually what it seems like bothered you was, oh, now I'm lumped with those people. Right. So every time we add context, we can run those issues.
Yeah. And that I have for the most part maintained my integrity. I mean, Jeff, that's a slap in my, that statement it'd be easier for me to take a physical punch in the gut than for someone to tell me I have for the most part maintained my integrity. Now that's just me. Maybe I'm weird.
Yeah.
But I'm being honest.
No, integrity is important.
There is nothing more important. My church, I am 100% convinced that God is not impressed with my preaching or my leadership ability or how large this church has grown. God is in no way impressed with any of that. The only way that I feel like I could, honor God is with my integrity. So it's at the core, to just throw that, for the most part, he's maintained his integrity. I just feel like that's a lazy comment that, that's just that, and maybe that's why it's just communication styles, Jeff. Not trying to speak to your heart, that you're trying to accuse me of something. Maybe it's just communication styles, but when I was a kid, literally when I was 5 years old, my mom turned to my dad and said, "This kid's going to be a lawyer. Like, he's going to be a lawyer." My dad said he'll
Sure.
argue with a road sign and take the wrong way home. My mentor
Yeah.
once told me, "You're just a contrarian, Jerry. That's your problem." So I realized me, knowing yourself is very important. But that just to get to what causes me that angst, it is, I read those words, I listen to those words, and if they're not, what I believe is exactly truthful, then I think they're lazy words and should be corrected.
All right, so real quick, I want to cut in and talk about the few red flags that you've seen there. Jerry ended by saying, hey, when words aren't completely honest, when you say something that is not completely honest, I think those are lazy words, and that becomes the problem. Now, we've already seen that Jerry said something already here that wasn't completely honest when he, really gaslit, whether he meant to do that or not. He gaslighted me by saying, hey, what you think you said, what you said wasn't the truth. Even though we can go back, look at the tape, and see that it was. He also talked about being a person who keeps his integrity all the time. And he took offense to that phrase, for the most part, you've kept your integrity. But what does integrity mean? It means wholeness. It means he's the same person everywhere he goes. And an antonym of integrity is dishonesty, which means that brutal honesty is a part of integrity. So Jerry says, hey, integrity is a big part of this for me. It's very important. And anytime words aren't completely honest, I think those are lazy words, okay? But he's holding me to that standard and not himself to that standard because he's worried about how he looks, not so much worried about how I look or worried about the conversation. That's how it felt to me. The other red flag was where he talked about being a contrarian. And I appreciate the self-awareness, okay? But you are going to find this with a lot of people with narcissistic behaviors. It comes from wanting to be a little bit of a contrarian. If you're always pushing kind of the other side, or you feel like you have to be right if someone doesn't agree with you, you're going to be more susceptible to narcissistic behavior. So again, nothing bad so far, but that's where those red flags came from, things to watch. Let's see how the conversation plays out. Sure. Well, we have a lot of that going on right now as we're entering toward an election season. There's people who every day think someone else uses lazy words because they think they're untruthful. And a lot of that's opinion based. A lot of that is it could be fixed with asking some questions. It could be fixed with listening. So, one of the scriptures that I share with people most, with the centers most on social media is James 1:19. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I think from looking at social media, we would all agree, and I think you even looking at our comments would agree, people often are quick to get angry before they ask any questions. Okay. So when I talk about, I think for the most part, you've kept your integrity. Integrity is important to me too. I built my ministry, built my life on integrity. But what does integrity mean? Integrity means oneness and wholeness. Zero of us are integrous all the time. That's if we are still sinful, if we haven't completely overcome sin and we're walking sinless, if we haven't done that, then we mess up at times. We sin at times. And those are moments where we're off integrity. So again, for the most part, even adding that context in this conversation, I don't remember a time where you have done something that's completely lost your integrity or that's been completely off the rails. I do think there's things that you've done. I think there's comments that you've said, and I don't have them pulled up in front of me right now, but I can go back to one as an example. I think there are comments that you have said that have not been above reproach, that they have needlessly hurt people because I think they've been just as lazy. I think we're all, so I'm not trying to accuse you because I think we're all lazy with words and comments at different times. My biggest concern in all of our social media dealings is it seems like for the majority of the comments, if not all of them, and again, I don't have them all up in front of me, it's a yes, other people are doing these things, but not us. We couldn't be a part of that. That's totally foreign to me. And I see a lot of the slippery systems like in Daystar that start out good, but can be slippery enough to get to those places if you're not careful. So my concern is, hey, I think this guy's probably trying to do it the right way. Everything I've heard is good. But if we don't have these conversations, most pastors who end up falling, I think started out in a good place. Most churches who end up with these abusive cultures, I think they started in a good place. That's why it's so important for us to have these, though, Jeremy, or Jerry, sorry. We want as many pastors as possible to finish well, not just for their own sake, but for the kingdom's sake, for the people that they lead. And if we don't address a lot of these things, we get there before we know it. And then it's easy to look up and say, how did I get in this place? Even in a week where, Tony Evans, someone who many of us never thought we would have his name attached to, sin and scandal. And, it's in the news, he's had to step away, which I'm grateful that he stepped away. I'm grateful that he has elders that can still hold him accountable, because that's kind of rare, these days from our dealings. But we just don't want your name. I don't want other people's names attached to these things, right? So, but I'll give you an example of one of the comments, since you've given, an example of some of ours. There was a comment that you left, I think it was about a week ago, on Instagram. And it was us having a conversation with Scott McKnight about some of the issues that have come up out of the mega church in the way that we view pastors and pastoral care and things like that. There was a comment that you left that was something along the lines of, and you can correct me of where I'm getting this wrong, but mega churches are basically where they're at because they've been doing something good, and a lot of small churches were dropping the ball. They weren't doing the job right. And then you have the mega church come in and do this, right? The way that comment was worded, we had other pastors in the comments that said, hey, I feel like you just, basically invalidated my ministry here. I thought that was a careless comment. Do I think that took away your integrity as a whole? No. Do I think that invited reproach? Yes, right? So again, I do those things too. I don't think any of us are fully
Let me ask,
above.
okay, Jeff, let's just talk about that for a minute, if I can
Sure.
get in for just a second.
Sure.
Why do you think the average size church in America is 65 today? Why is there an attendance of 65 in the average church? Are they doing things well with 65 people there?
What's your actual question, man? We don't do those kind of questions here. I could tell you what they're called and why we don't do those kind of questions here, but I don't want to be argumentative. But that's not. Ask the actual question you're asking. Don't dance around it.
You just challenged my assumption that small churches are not doing a good job.
No, sir, I didn't challenge your assumption. I challenged the way that you spoke that comment, the way that you put it in. It invited reproach because it sounded so demeaning to small churches. So again, that's where assumption comes in. You're putting words in my mouth. We haven't actually had that conversation yet because you didn't lead with questions on that comment. You led with something that felt like it was very demeaning towards small churches, and basically said, it felt in a lot of ways like we need to give the church, the mega church, a pass because it's doing such a good job, right?
No,
we believe
that's not
churches
what it
of
felt
all
like.
sizes.
That's what the thing is, Jeff, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to find it. I made a factual statement.
All right, so let's break just a second and talk about those red flags. The red flags in this section, they started with a deflection from Jerry, that we were talking about his comment, how it affected people, how it felt demeaning to people, how it invited reproach. And instead, he wanted to reframe the question and deflect. Jeff, do you think a church of 65 is successful? Now, first of all, to answer that, I would need a lot more information because the success of a church is not determined by attendance. But I didn't want to answer that at all because that was a deflection. And deflections are common narcissistic behaviors and responses in conversations like this. Now, when I pushed back on that, Jerry wanted to say, hey, you're the one who challenged my assumption that small churches weren't healthy or weren't growing, or however that he said it, when the reality was that wasn't what I challenged at all. So that was a form of gaslighting and, again, deflection. Well, I'm just answering because you challenged this assumption. That wasn't what we were challenging. What I challenged was the impact his comment had on people. And I actually wasn't finished setting that up because there was a lot of nuance to how that affected people. And I wanted to set it up for people who hadn't seen the comment. The next couple of red flags hit all together and a lot happened in just a few seconds as I tried to redirect the conversation back to the original question. And I said, hey, Jerry, your comment felt like it was demeaning to small churches and small church pastors. He responded, that's not what it felt like. That's not what it felt like was literally gaslighting my feelings. It was invalidating my feelings, which are not something that you can invalidate. They're not factual. A person can feel something even if you don't agree with why they should feel it. Okay. And this wasn't just me. We were having this conversation because, again, other people in these comments, other pastors had felt that way. So the first thing he did was he said, no, that's not how it felt, as if he knew my feelings and why I felt that way. The next thing he said right after that is, Jeff, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to find it. And that's a form of blame shifting and villainizing. Okay, blame shifting, villainizing. And if you're familiar with Darvo, which is the way that we most commonly look at narcissistic abuse in churches and outside of churches, it stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So not only did he blame shift and villainize me in the moment, to basically it implied, that phrasing right after saying that's not how it felt, that implied that I'm only finding these things because I'm looking for them. Jeff, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to find it. It reversed victim and offender, okay? Now all of a sudden he's reversed it to he's the victim of me looking for things to poke on, and completely moving right past the point that he offended other people with those comments. He offended other pastors and other Christians with those comments online, which is what we were talking about. And then the final red flag before we move on into the rest of his discussion there was he said, I gave you a factual statement. Okay, I gave you a factual statement, and basically is trying to put it on us as, hey, Jeff, I gave you a factual statement and you're just dismissing the facts, which couldn't be farther from the truth. So you see 4 red flags, if I'm counting right, 4 red flags in the span of just a couple of seconds. If you're not familiar with narcissistic behaviors in conversation, you won't recognize that and your head will be spinning. I'm telling you, I am trained. I am trauma-informed trained. I recognize this. I know how to handle these triggers, and my head was still spinning. So this stuff happens really, really fast, but the more we recognize it, the more we can catch it and we can respond to it in hopefully a helpful way. Let's jump right back into the conversation.
I came from a church of 35 people. Like, that's what I grew up in. I met Jesus that way. I didn't know they were doing a lot of things poorly at the time. And then we just started learning. I felt a call to preach, and I started learning and growing and giving it my all. And I didn't know what a mega church is. I hate that language. You'll never hear that language to me with my staff or with my church. But just people started coming. And then, when the 2000th person showed up, I guess we became a mega church. Like, I think that's the other thing too. Like, I think deconstruction is one of the easiest things to do, really. Like, like I said, I built my church on some of the same things you're pointing out. We pushed back against organized religion. I said, the way church is going is just wrong. And so I started in a abandoned Piggly Wiggly. I don't know if you know what Piggly Wigglies are, but they're really cheap redneck grocery stores.
Oh, and yeah, I've been to my fair share of pigs.
Okay, so we started in an abandoned Piggly Wiggly and just had a handful of people. And really a large number of those were drug addicts or people recovering from drug addiction. They were no white collar people, and we were just pushing back against the establishment. And when so many people, we had 1 acre of property, we had 53 parking spots, and when the church grew to 800 on 1 acre of property, and we had to move, and we built a nice facility. In one day, I became the establishment. Like, we've been preaching against the establishment for 6 years here, and then now, because we bought a piece of property and built a building, now all of a sudden I am the establishment. And that's really, when I think about it, like what God dealt in my heart about over time was, and my preaching has changed. I don't attack other churches and other ministries the way I did early on. I'll still make some comments about the way religion is in this country, but I'm very careful about other churches, because I was, just thinking and praying one day, and Jesus reminded me of his statement that I will build my church. and you can knock away at some of the things that are wrong in the church, because there's a lot of those things, and I still do that. That's still a part of my pulpit. But at the end of the day, if you're not building the church, if you're not partnering with Jesus to build the church, then you're not moving in the same direction that he's moving in. And so at some point, the deconstruction, the disruption has to turn into normalization and the construction of something. And that's what changed in my ministry, is after raging against the machine, until I didn't become the thing I raged against, but in some people's minds, and I felt like in yours, Jeff, like I just became, because the 2000th person came and that identified me as a megachurch now all of a sudden I'm this problem that I have been preaching against for years. I'm sorry about my voice.
No, I get it, man. It's allergy season. We're the same way.
But you
that's
see
really
my point. Like that I didn't change who I was.
Yeah.
Like just because all of a sudden enough people came that we could build an actual like permanent building. Now all of a sudden, we're and like most mega churches, I hate that language, because when I hear most people online talk about mega churches, they're actually talking about Stephen Furtick. They're talking about Joel Osteen. They're talking about Craig Rochelle. Those are not mega churches. Those are giga churches, churches of 10,000 or more. And a mega church, depending on who you talk to, some people say it's 1,200, 1,800, 2,000. It might be like my church, a multi-campus church in small towns. We've got a campus of 300, a campus of 600, a larger campus, but it's really not in the same vein as all of that mega church talk. When people say a mega church, they're talking about a completely different animal than us. We're just a church in a community. We serve, we care for people, we help women, who choosing not to have an abortion. We build orphanages. We're just like a big neighborhood church, and I just don't feel like that's the same as this language that you and a lot of people online are deconstructing against with these, big old celebrity pastors. Like nobody knows who I am. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm not one of those guys. And there's a distinction there that I think a lot of times people don't draw.
Yeah, for sure. I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to the term giga church before you shared it with us. And I want to talk about that here in a minute, because it's really not the numbers. It's not, hey, you hit 2,000 people and you're a mega church that we talk about. We talk a lot about mega church systems. So we'll have that conversation in just a minute, because mega church systems, as we tell a lot of people, that affects churches that are much smaller than a mega church. And most of the stuff we're talking about are mega church systems, because they're becoming systemic issues even outside, of the mega church. But I want to go back to just, again, that comment, because I think this is what we miss on social media so much, which leads to arguments I don't think people would have, face to face in the same way. And, you've seen that over the years with church people and just individuals. It's really easy to get heated, when you're not looking eyeball to eyeball with somebody, right? One of the things, I'm going to read the comment here in a minute, and we'll talk about it, because people can take it in different ways. And again, context matters. What was the video about? That sort of thing. But when I said it felt like, I didn't accuse you of, of saying, hey, I think this was what you were trying to do. I think your motive was trying to dismiss small churches or this, that, the other. When I said that's what it felt like, that's how it came across to me, right? So when your initial response was, that's not what it felt like, I gave a factual statement. One of the things, and this is unique, being married to a therapist, you never get to say, that's not what it felt like to someone, right? And that's part of where we've gotten to with a lot of the church hurt and spiritual abuse conversations, is when you have the victims or people who feel like they've been victimized who will come out and say, hey, I felt like this was going on. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes the truth may not line up with their feelings, but if we dismiss them before we hear them, that can lead to a lot more damage than even the first wound, right? So I did want to mention that, just because I think it's always dangerous when we tell someone that what they felt is,
I appreciate that, Jeff. I don't discount your feelings. I think the point I was trying to make is, you're in the business of finding those kinds of issues. That's your job. That's your career. So you're going to feel that way. That's kind of what you're looking for. I think the point I was trying to make is if you're trying to
Sure.
find somebody who's demeaning, somebody's in a larger church who's demeaning. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I also run a nonprofit, donates all the money to pastors in small churches, and I've coached several thousand churches. And it's a nonprofit organization. I don't draw a salary from it. We donate the money right back to pastors in crisis. That's a major concern of mine is these pastors. It is factually not true that I'm condescending to these people, but churches, the point I was making is okay, T.D. Jakes pastored in, I think it's West Virginia or somewhere for several years, church of a few hundred people. He got recognized by TBN, moved to Dallas, boom, 10, 20,000 people, whatever. Okay, that happens. But that's not the way most, quote, mega churches became big churches. They really did a good job.
All right, the last couple of red flags, Jerry's just talking about all the good that they do, the good the nonprofit does, the good that he does. And it's almost this idea that because I do good, something bad can't be happening. There can't be concerns about these things. When the truth is, most churches we have concerns about, and most churches that end up having spiritual abuse cases are also doing good things. The presence of good things doesn't mean that there can't be bad things there. All right. The two can happen at one time. And you're going to see this time and time again. Jerry comes back to this line of responses. Let's talk about all the good we're doing, all the good I'm doing. And it's almost this idea of how can we be bad if we're doing good things? How can there be concerns or questions or things we need to fix if we're doing good things? And this is something that people who have narcissistic responses and behaviors like to do a lot. Let's look at all the good that we're doing. That must mean that there can't be any bad here. Or don't look at the bad, just look at the good, right? And the truth is, we've got to look at all of them at the same time. And then the last thing he says in that section is it's factually not true that I'm condescending these small pastors or that I'm condescending to them in the comments. It is actually factually true that people said in those comments they felt like he was being condescending to them. That's all I was doing, was sharing how people said that they felt. But Jerry likes to come back to these ideas of it's factually not true that I'm not. And what was his backup for this truth that he factually couldn't be condescending to these small church pastors? And it's, well, because I help them and I do good things for them. It can be true that you do good things for small church pastors, and I really do believe that Jerry does. At the same time, it's very true that it felt and people felt like he was being condescending toward small churches and small church pastors in that moment. But again, when people are given narcissistic responses, they like to paint things as facts that aren't really facts. And as you're going to see as we move on, they like to deny facts that are very provable, okay? Things are facts if they're my opinion, and if they don't fit with my opinion or my narrative, they can't be facts. Or I don't care about the facts.
Created small groups, and they have, life change happens, and people, are ministered to, and they're cared for, and drug addicts get set free, and people find purpose and meaning. They get to be a part of something bigger than themselves. That's the way our church was built. And so instead of, and this is another thing, because I've spent thousands of hours with small church pastors training them, instead of saying, oh, it's just like all those people Jeff talks about, they're just all, crooks and criminals, and that's why their church is that big. I want them to go, let's look in the mirror and say, what can I do? Let me talk about what Jerry can do. I don't want to talk about what the guy with the NDA at the mega church in Louisville did. I want to talk about what can Jerry do today to do a better job fulfilling God's calling on my life. That's been my message, actually, to my members, but to pastors as well, is quit looking at whatever, and you and I will forever argue about what that percentage is. I think it's a small percentage. You see a lot more of it than I do. But whatever percentage of these people are who lack integrity, and they're just not exemplifying Christian character, even though they're pastoring these big churches. I want people to to say, okay, that's awful and that's terrible. But as a pastor, what can I do instead of just, discounting, well, that guy in that big church did that. That's why I can't have a big church. I have too much integrity. I want them to go, no, I want to reach as many people as I can. And whatever big that is, that's God's in charge of that. He builds the church. But I'm not going to discount someone else's work because someone over there did something crazy. I'm gonna try to be inspired by the good work of other pastors and see if I can draft from that and learn from those people.
Yeah, no, that's good. And that's one of the things that we ask. That's, the funny thing is, Jerry, I think that's one of the things that in this specific realm, a lot of pastors miss. I think it's one thing that at least at times you have missed is instead of saying, hey, I want to look in the mirror and say, from what they're talking about, what could I learn? What could Daystar learn so we can be as healthy of a church as possible? It feels like at a lot of times that you jump in more with a critique of, but that's not all churches, but that's not my church. But again, I want to talk about I think we'll get in that conversation with the Giga church versus mega church. I do want to look at this comment.
Can I just respond to this,
Sure.
Jeff? Because you said that's something I've missed. And I just want to just point out, you chose to be on TikTok and the limitations that come with TikTok and the small number of characters that I can respond with. That's your choice to be there. And so you really, again, you cage that accusation as how you felt. So again, that means I can't push back on it because you feel how you feel. But from a factual standpoint, you really can't know if I've missed something. I had a little comment. You may have had
from a factual standpoint, you're not asking a lot of questions. You've not publicly asked any questions or commented about how this could affect your church. Your comments have all been about how this doesn't affect churches like mine. This is the Giga church. This is other church.
I didn't say it doesn't affect. I don't think I've said it doesn't affect churches like mine. And there may be many
talked
things.
About it. And you have said this isn't my church.
Very
this
limited,
isn't all churches.
Yeah, you have a very limited platform for those comments because you put that on TikTok, and so you offered me an opportunity to give more context. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm on this podcast for that reason. But yeah. I often listen to what you say. It often has an impact on me. It often makes me look in the mirror every day of my life. That's what I'm doing to try to make our church better. It just hearing a couple comments on a limited scope doesn't really give full context to what's going on in my head. Like whether or not I've missed what they're saying, you can't really know that because you don't know what's in my head. Now you can say, "Hey, you're not commenting on," and that's a fact. Maybe that's factual. But a lot of what you say, you're not the only one saying it. We're encircled. Our culture is. Evangelicalism is exploding. The church's influence is shrinking. Like I am very well aware of that. I'm very well
Which
aware.
Are all good indicators of how big of a problem this is, right? So you and I will argue over percentages. You think it's a much smaller problem than I do. I would say
I don't think it's a small problem, Jeff. I really don't. I don't think it's a small problem at all. I think it's a massive problem. I'd probably see it, why and how it's become such a massive problem. I might see that a little bit differently than you, but I don't think there is any daylight between your opinion and mine about how bad of a problem this is. Like we are simpatico in that. You are 100% accurate in my mind. This is a massive and growing problem, and it's growing exponentially. So I'm aware. That's why I'm listening to you. That's why I'm, commenting on your stuff, is that I am aware it's a massive problem and I'm listening to you and other voices in that arena. I just don't agree necessarily with why the problem is the way it is or what all contributes to the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that. I think, what I was trying to get at a moment ago is regardless of what's going on in your head, people are watching. People watch how we respond. People watch how pastors respond. We get that a lot. They watch how pastors respond in our comments because a lot of pastors do not respond well. Okay. And in a lot of ways, you've responded better because you've kept your composure. You kept yourself, you're cool. But if every comment is a defense, then what people will see is another defensive pastor fighting against these issues. The thing that helps most, and I'll just throw this out there, the thing that helps most of the people who are listening to us, we hear this time and time again, is when they see pastors who will go, you know what, you're right on this, or you're right on some of this. I didn't agree with this part. I got a question about this part, but you were right on this, right? That lets them know people see the problem. Church leaders are often known in these situations. When we talk about spiritual abuse or church hurt or deconstruction, it is really easy for church leaders to get defensive. And that is the response people expect. It's not the response that I believe is going to bring people back to engaging in the church without fear, right? We want
Can I
people,
talk
we don't
about
want people
why they get
saying,
defensive?
sure,
Can I talk a little bit about why I think they get defensive?
sure.
I think one of the reasons they get defensive, and you've had some a lot of ministry experience as well, so you might agree. But pastors are probably it's funny, like when you announce you're at a dinner party or you're meeting people on a plane, you tell them you're a pastor. I always feel like their first thought is, oh, this guy's going to judge me. And then immediately they're judging me. Like I think what's funny is like I consider myself one of the least judgmental people there is in the world because, I mean, I've got former drug addicts on my staff. Like, so I don't ever think you're too far gone. I mean, so much. I don't know who on my staff's watching this, so I don't want to go into it, but there's a lot of jacked up backgrounds of people leading my church. So I'm not judgmental, but I'm judged. Like, I think pastors are often judged and they are 100% often misquoted. And people often tell stories out of context or just outright lies on them. And so when a pastor is reading, or hearing about a story of someone, in the back of his mind, he's probably, or she is probably thinking, I remember when that person told that lie on me. I wonder if this is another one of those cases.
All right, so real quick, these last 7 or 8 red flags, what do they all got in common? There's a lot of reversing victim and offender here. Okay, there's a lot of, well, people think of this about pastors, but look at what pastors have to go through. They're the real victims. People say these things where they get hurt, but look at how pastors get hurt. And while there is some truth to that, that is not the role of pastors as far as the role of church leaders. That's not going to be our role in fixing spiritual abuse, in creating healthy environments. We have to be able to own up and say, why do people feel the way they feel? Why do people feel judged by me? Why would people make up stories, right? And even though he says, hey, a lot of pastors get stories made up about them, we know that the data shows that somewhere between 93 and 97% of all abuse allegations prove out to be true. The majority of people who say, I experienced abuse, whether that's spiritual, sexual, physical, I don't think it matters. The majority of people who say, I experienced abuse, it turns out they're telling the truth when it's investigated. So it is very dangerous for church leaders to continually reverse victim and offender there and say, well, but pastors are victims too. Yes, they can be. But more often than not, when people bring abuse allegations, it turns out to be true for a reason. And we can't just assume. That's one of the things he said in the last part there. I begin to wonder, I hear this other story and I begin to wonder, did somebody, tell a lie about them? Because I remember when someone told a lie about me. That is a dangerous place to be. We need to assume that there is some weight to every single allegation until the investigation has been done. Let an independent investigation be done. Let the truth come out instead of assuming that it is true or it isn't true. Let's investigate it as if it may be true. And then once the truth comes out, we can move on from there. But the amount of times that he painted, himself and other pastors as potential victims there, I think that was very disconcerting given the conversation that we're having and the topic of spiritual abuse.
Because Jeff, man, I have been lied on and about more times than I could possibly explain in this podcast. And I think if occasionally we just recognize there's two sides of this. There's some judgmental, there's some pastors who lack integrity, but then there is like thousands of them who get up every day, they pray, they read the word, they serve people, and they're mistreated. I mean, that happens all the time, and they
Yeah.
live as well as they know how. And that's another side of this thing.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about that. I mean, we've talked about that very clearly from the beginning. This is not all pastors. We believe there's as many pastors, if not more, who were doing this for the right reasons, who aren't spiritually abusive. We talked about that from the beginning on the
I just don't think
podcast with
that makes
Scott
your
McKnight.
highlight reel, Jeff. It doesn't seem like that makes the highlight reel. Because like I told you, I've been watching just on
Sure.
TikTok, and I just don't see that content. It's always, the other side.
Well, you got to think about what our mission is. Our mission is not to celebrate. We don't exist as an organization to celebrate what pastors are doing right. We try to celebrate that when we can, but we exist because there's a growing problem. So yes, we're going to talk more about the problem. We're going to talk about red flags of it. We're going to talk about potential solutions for it. We're going to talk a whole lot about the problem until the problem is fixed. That's why we exist, and we will stop existing when the problem is fixed or the problem is closer to remedied. A moment ago, you mentioned this being my career. I have not taken a paycheck from this. And for the first about 7 months, we spent about 10 grand a month to make this happen. So this is like any other ministry that I've ever been willing to do. If I'm not willing to do it for free, and if I'm not willing to hemorrhage money and put into it, then I'm not going to do it. So some people are like, oh, this is a career for you, so obviously you're going to do these things. And I know you didn't say, that's why I was doing all these things, but you did mention that it was a career. It's not a career. I, operate 2 businesses. I work a night job. People would be blown away if they knew what we actually do to make this happen. We do it because we care about it. We do it because we've been touched by it. And from the very beginning, we talked about, I have been both the pastor in the seat that got to an abusive place and didn't realize how I got there, and I've been the one abused. So we look at this and say, we want to help everybody, including those pastors. But no, we are going to talk more about the problem, because the problem is what's destroying people. Okay, healthy pastors are not destroying people's lives. The abuse is destroying people. The cover-ups are destroying people. So I totally get it from being in ministry. I get why pastors get defensive. But as shepherds, we've got to get less defensive. And if what you're doing is right, and I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about all of us. If what a shepherd is doing right, if what you're doing is right, then you don't have to be defensive about someone saying something else about a system over here, right? And even if we feel like we
Jeff,
need to be defensive, we need to ask questions first. We need to say, hey, even if I want to defend against part of this and part of this is wrong, what can I actually learn from it, right? So I want to talk about this comment, though. I've been trying to get to it for a little bit. You said, and this was on the video with Scott McKnight, where we were talking about how the megachurch movement starting in the 80s has changed the way we view what a pastor is in culture. I don't know if you're familiar with Scott McKnight's work, but he's a world-renowned theologian, author. He is well respected across Christendom. But you said the sad truth is that small churches in America have largely failed. That was how it started. And larger churches are actually doing a lot of things well: worship experiences, teaching opportunities, multi-generational ministry, discipleship through small groups, service to the community, missions, etc. Mega churches are an easy target today, but most of them got big by doing things well. So that was the comment I was talking about. And when you start with the truth is most small churches have failed, look at all the good things mega churches are doing, here's how they've gotten there. Especially in response to that video, where we weren't saying everything about the mega church was bad. We were saying, hey, the mega church has changed the way that we view pastors. It's changed the way that we view worship, which I think is pretty factual. And he laid out why that is, why it's changed over the course of 40 years, right? And we had multiple people who responded. I responded, pretty heavy-handed there, because I thought that was dismissive and I thought it was reductionist. But we also had other people, including pastors and people in churches, who took offense to that. And that was what I was talking about when I said, I think there are places where you have invited reproach. I think in that defensiveness, you painted with the same broad brush that you often, would think that, or that people often would think that we do. I don't know if you've actually said broad brush. But I want to talk about that comment, because everything's not untrue. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I do think you paint with a broad brush. I was really thinking to myself, you're accusing me of what you do on your social media channel, and maybe we both do that. But I guess to know where I come from, and again, I'm not able to provide a podcast response to a podcast clip. I've got a limited number of comments I can make, but I have tried for many years, for about, I guess probably close to 15 years. I've been a church trainer, and I've tried to get the attention of pastors. The small church is failing. I mean, I completely, as you were
What do you
reading
mean by
that, I was
failing?
like,
Because that was going to be my question. What do you mean by
mhm.
failing?
So engaging the community and reaching people to share the gospel and having people receive, make disciples. That's the calling of of all churches, all believers, to make disciples. And they're not doing that. I mean, they are not doing that very well. I know I grew up in it.
And why do you
I
believe they're not
coach.
doing that well on a large scale?
Well, a lot of it is like this. Um, they've conflated their beliefs. So tradition and politics has been conflated with theology. So the
Well,
traditional
the
way of
political
music,
conflation is as bad, if not worse, in the megachurch right now, especially with like you're looking
in
at
some
Christian
mega churches, yeah,
nationalism, you're looking at Trump stuff.
in
Like we're
some.
seeing it. Well, we're seeing it across the board, across sizes. I see it more from megachurches than small churches
Well,
these
you're
days.
going to see more mega churches than you see. I mean, how many uh, live streams have you watched from Buck Creek Baptist Church? I mean, you're not going to see that. But listen, I'm with you on that, except for the comment that it's in it. We're seeing it in the mega church.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like not in this mega church. Like we don't do it, and I know a lot of
Yeah.
mega churches that just will not
But if the
go there.
doctor tells you, Jerry, if the doctor says you got cancer in your body, you wouldn't go, well, not in this arm, not in these fingers, not
That's a bad
not
analogy,
here.
Jeff. That analogy doesn't really
No,
hold up
I don't think
because
it's a
I'm in
bad
charge.
analogy. We're all the body of Christ.
How do you know
and
what I
all of
think, Jeff? You won't let me
every
finish my statement. You have no idea what I'm even trying to say. You're pushing back on the statement before I finish the statement. Is that a
Well, Jerry,
conversation? If
Jerry,
you
that's
just,
how
Jeff, let me just say, if you just want to read comments that you've selected and beat me over the head with a folding chair, I'm out. I'm not here for that. If you want to have a conversation, I'll have a conversation, but I'm just not going to sit here and be beat up for, taking statements I've made and just trying to correct me. I'm not here for a correction. I'm here for a
do you
conversation.
think? Well, I'm not sure that you are because you have talked so much. I've been trying to get this question out about your comment. You still haven't let me ask the full question in over 30 minutes, Jerry. This becomes part of the problem. You don't see how often you have interrupted me, yet you get pissed off and lose your mind on a rant because I ask you a follow-up question. I didn't beat you over the head with a chair. I haven't been hard on you. I have been snowflake pillow fluff easy on you. Okay. You want me to ask you a hard one? I'll ask you a hard one. I'll show you one like that. 24 to double, your nonprofit. Okay. It promotes plagiarism. You actually say, if you sign up and you sign up this way, you'll get a year's worth of sermons completely done for you. I think plagiarism is completely wrong. That's a hard question. So tell us, why are you promoting the plagiarism of sermons so that pastors can grow their church instead of getting a word from God? If you want me to beat you up over the head, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, that was weak. You're going to have to swing harder than that, Jeff. Let me clarify that for you.
All right, guys, so that was it. I let my anger get the better of me in that moment, and I really do apologize. Like I said, the conversation is about to get better. But before it does, you notice his very first response, very first red flag after I reset the conversation this way and let him know that he wasn't going to just get to take control. The first response was, that's weak. You're going to have to do better. That's weak. When we go back to the narcissistic responses, the common narcissistic responses that we have, there's a couple of things that happened all at once with a comment like, that's weak. It's devaluation. It's humiliation. It's blame shifting, because he's about to say, if you'd done your research, you would know, which is where the blame shifting is going to come from. And it's belittling. Those are all things that happen in this one comment. And if you've been around people who tend to respond to those narcissistic responses, they love things like, that's weak. And I'm about to call him out on it. You're going to see. But again, people who respond this way, these narcissistic behaviors, they tend to double down on them until they realize they're just not going to work, and then they'll try another way. So when I call this out, you're going to see a really quick transition, and he's going to be different. There's going to be some more red flags, but he is going to be different in the conversation for the rest of the time once I call this out.
If you were paying more attention and you'd done better research,
that's such
you'd
a
realize
narcissistic response.
What I tell
that's
them
weak. Instead of just answering the question,
I'm
you
trying
got to
to
stop
answer
it
the
with
question,
that.
Jeff. I'm
Yeah,
trying
but
to
you
answer the
started
question.
it with "that's weak." Come on, man. That's
You're
that same
yelling at
kind of blame
me.
shifting and villainization. Well, there's a reason why, Jerry.
You're yelling at me. You're talking about, yeah, here's the chair. I'll hit you with the chair. Here it comes. What, you trying to bully me, Jeff? Is that what this is about? You're going to bully me?
And while it gets better, just like in most narcissistic conversations like this, before it gets better, it does get a little worse, all right? So the first response that Jerry has is to say that's weak if you had done your research. And I immediately just called it out. Hey, man, that's such a narcissistic response. We're not doing that. And then did you see what he did? How we tried to turn it again? Oh my gosh, you're yelling at me. It's reverse victim and offender. I called him out on a narcissistic response and said, I'm not going to be talked to that way. And then he says, you're yelling at me, which, by the way, I actually wasn't yelling. That is not yelling, at least from my perspective, that's not yelling. You guys can tell me if you see a different perspective. I thought it was a lot better when I watched it on this side. But he says, you're yelling at me. You're talking about hitting me with a chair. And the chair analogy was using his words, which I'm about to say. That was using Jerry's words. So now, because I tell him you can't talk to me that way, and I'm using his words, he turns it around and it's complete reversal of victim and offender and says, are you trying to bully me? Is that what it's about? Are you trying to bully me? When all of the things he had been saying for the past 4 or 5 minutes was an attempt to bully me into submission, to go and take the conversation where he wanted it to go. That's how narcissistic leaders and leaders who have narcissistic responses, that is how they respond. And while I'm not calling Jerry a narcissistic leader, the way he responded was incredibly narcissistic. And what he was accusing me of bullying was projection, which is another narcissistic response. He was projecting onto me what he was actually doing. And I just want you to see this because this is a classic response from leaders who do this, right? So if you're ever dealing with narcissistic responses from a church leader, you're going to see and you're going to hear things like this if you push too hard. No, I'm responding with your words. That's another narcissistic response. You're trying to put on me what you're doing. Come on, bro.
I'm a narcissist. Okay. All right. Any more words?
No.
Any more accusations for me
Jerry,
before I answer?
You said words were important to you, right? I didn't say you were a narcissist. I said that was a narcissistic response. We've had multiple podcasts on that.
Well,
You've never listened to a podcast. You have no idea. We're all in the narcissistic
I listen to
spectrum.
lots of podcasts.
If you had listened,
or
a couple of quick things you're going to notice here. First of all, he says, okay, so I'm a narcissist. Do you have any more accusations? And I'm going to clarify in just a minute. I never called him a narcissist. I said those are narcissistic responses, which we talk about often on the podcast. We're all capable of those. But there's a really small thing he did there, and you're going to hear it. He's going to do it some more that I want to point out because this is really, really important and it's something that a lot of us miss. If you notice over this, he did it just in that last like 30 seconds, but he'd done it before that, and he's going to do it after it. He'll just start laughing. When I call him on things or I push on something or I say, you're not going to talk to me that way, he'll just laugh. Now, why do you do that? That is a narcissistic response that is called baiting. Baiting. And baiting, again, it could be laughter like that. That's one of the easiest ways that you see it, but it's any kind of response that they give you, often nonverbal, that is literally designed. The reason they're doing it is to get an emotional response out of you. Because if they can elicit an emotional response out of you, they can make you look bad and you look like the villain and they come out as the innocent victim. Okay, so whether Jerry knew he was doing it or not, every time he laughed, it was a baiting response. Because if I had lost my cool and I had let my anger go farther than I had let it go already, then I would look like the bad guy, right? So if he can get me to blow up, then I look like the bad guy. He can disconnect and he's the good guy and I'm the bad guy versus us having the tough conversation Anyway, now we're going to be able to get through it. We're going to be able to have the conversation. And again, it calms down in just a minute. But anytime you hear and see that, you may not even realize it, but baiting reactions like that will make a person's blood boil. And often it either elicits an angry response, an overly emotional response, or it will make you just walk away from the conversation. And then again, a narcissistic leader or someone responding that way will use it to make you look bad, and they'll use it to make it look like you're the problem. So if you've ever experienced baiting, maybe you didn't know what to call it, that's what it is. And man, guys, it will make you lose control and feel crazy really, really fast. So the more I heard him laugh, the more I realized I've got to calm down. I've got to stay calm, because the only way I'm going to keep control of this conversation, I'm going to have to call him out on the narcissistic responses. I'm going to have to set clear, hard boundaries. You're not going to talk to me this way. This is what we're going to talk about. But also in doing that, I had to stay calm, because otherwise, if I let my emotions take control, I let my anger take control, I was actually going to be playing right into his hands. If you had listened to any of our podcasts, you would know what that means. Okay, you can have a narcissistic response. So can I. I have been guilty of it, and not be a narcissist. I was using your words of the chair analogy. Those were your words. I'm calling back to you. What I'm simply saying is I'm trying to be nice. We tried to have a conversation, and every time it doesn't go the way you want it to go, you co-opt it, you move it, and then if I try to move it back where I want the conversation to go as the podcast host, you accuse me of not letting you talk. So again, I'm still trying to get to the first question about the comment and understand there. And we were having a conversation about that. And you were the one who got upset and then started accusing me of all the things. So if you want to have a conversation, I think this one can be good, but we're going to have to actually talk about it. Let's talk about 24 to double. Since I brought it up, since you wanted me to give you harder ones, let's talk about it.
Okay, I don't remember asking you to give me harder ones, but that's fine. I'll be happy to answer that question. 24 to double helps mostly bivocational pastors who have full-time work, and they minister to churches on the side, or it's basically a 2 full-time job. We tell pastors, if you sign up for this first session, we tell pastors this is this is Christ's model for the church. The title of our program is Christ Model for the Church, but pastors won't click on that. So we call it 24 to double. And the first session they're in, we tell them, hey, this is about modeling your church after Christ's discipleship model. And it's going to be a heavy lift, because the way church has been done in America is in a steep decline. It's not reaching people. So you're going to have to change a whole lot of stuff. So I'm going to share with you sermons that I have written, and you can take that research and you can turn that into your own sermon. I'll tell them, oftentimes you can take someone else's filet mignon and put it through your meat grinder and make a really nice hamburger. It's yours, it's yours. Someone else did some research. You borrowed some quotes or something like that. I don't think that's plagiarism. Another false accusation you made against me.
Can I give you a quote, please?
Asking people.
Could I give you a quote? Bonus number 1. This is a bonus that they get on your website. Sermons 365. I have actually done my research. When you accuse me of not doing that. 1 full year of sermons, this year's worth of messages, is a shortcut to free up your schedule and make space for implementing the 24 to double training with your team. You're able to use these pre-written messages as a starting point for sermon development, or use them as written and quickly build high quality sermons. Using them as written is plagiarism by definition, factually.
I don't think so. If you publish something that someone else wrote, I think that's plagiarism. If you take a note to the platform and you use the same point.
If you speak the sermon as written, that's plagiarism. You're passing it off as your own.
Yeah, it's not a manuscript like that. They wouldn't be able to take those notes and say what I said, because the notes are not complete like that. It's an outline. My sermons are an outline form. They're not in manuscript form. So it'd be impossible to take an outline to the platform and say, exactly what I say.
Do you see why I asked the question, though? Because there's a big industry that is made right now off of selling sermons pre-done manuscript that they can pass off as their own to bivocational pastors, right? There's in mega churches, there are oftentimes either they're buying those sermons, they're having ghostwriters write those sermons. There's a lot of plagiarism that's going on. There's a lot of people who aren't preaching their own sermons, which becomes an issue of itself, right? So there's a good reason to ask those.
Do you think it was fair to accuse me of plagiarism?
I do, because the way it's written on your website, that is plagiarism to me. I think it was very fair. All right, so the first red flag, after I gave him the quote and explained that by definition that was plagiarism, his only response was, I don't think so. We're going to go farther into the facts here. One of the things you're going to notice, and again, this is common with narcissistic responses, they will double down no matter what facts that you give them, okay? They're going to do that. But what you also saw with that last red flag, this is a brand new tactic. And again, remember at the beginning when I shared the classic narcissistic responses, one of them is, it's not fair. One of them is, it's not fair, because people who have these responses tend to think that there are different sets of rules for them and everyone else. So a lot of times they'll say, that's not fair. Or as he said it, do you think it was fair to ask me if that was plagiarism, right? And I thought it was completely fair, and I told him why. That's one of those things that we often miss and don't realize as a part of the narcissistic response, okay? So the aggressive kind of bullying tactics didn't work. The constant deflection and, blame shifting and victim and offender reversal, none of those have worked so far. So at this point, he's moving to a new tactic. And as soon as he comes on screen there, he's got his head down. He's sad. And, well, Jeff, do you think it was fair to do that? And a lot of times we'll feel bad and we'll say, well, maybe it wasn't fair. Well, the truth was, it was a very fair question. And it was fair to continue with the question, and it was fair to give definitions like I'm going to. It was fair to give him the quote. It was very fair. But that is a common go-to response by people who are either narcissist or narcissistic in responses in a certain conversation. You're going to hear a lot of that. Is that fair? And this one's going to come up. If you watch the rest of this conversation, he's going to use that, fair tactic quite a few times, because I don't push back against it really hard. So he feels like it gives him some control and he's going to keep using it. But just be aware that that's not fair. Is that fair? You're being unfair. All of those sorts of things are a common go-to for people who are exhibiting narcissistic behavior and narcissistic responses.
It was not plagiarism. You did interrupt me about 4 times in my answer. Just to clarify, I'm not doing all the interrupting here, Jeff. But it's not plagiarism, and it is helping a lot of small church pastors. I know, I've been a small church pastor. I know how difficult it can be, and using content that other people developed to help you get an idea. If you're preaching, I don't know about your background, if you were a every weekend platform communicator or not, but like if you do that for many, many years, finding some inspiration, a different idea, listening to a podcast, a book, someone else's sermon, get even a song to get you some kind of inspiration is helpful, because one of the reasons people leave the church is that you get bored with this pastor telling the same stuff, not having creativity, and we are all limited in creativity. We don't all have the most creative minds there, and so I don't think there's anything wrong with helping a pastor get his content together.
Yeah, for 17 years, I averaged speaking about twice a week. So I know how hard it is to put those together, and it is hard. At the same time, we'll never run out of Bible to preach. We won't. I'm not saying you can't use an illustration. I'm not saying you can't learn from other people, but plagiarism is the use of another's work, words, or ideas without attribution. That's what it is. So there is Josh Howerton is another pastor in Dallas who recently wrote a whole blog defending plagiarism. He's been caught in plagiarism multiple times. He's just defended it, as we all share these things everywhere. Most parishioners that I have talked to do not feel comfortable with their pastor plagiarizing their sermons, because they assume that pastor has done the work to get a word from the Lord, that they've done their own study, that they've done that. When they realize that a pastor's reading off a teleprompter, or they Google, the phrase that was used and find out that another pastor, has been using that almost verbatim, or that they're buying sermons, that takes a lot of trust in an economy where the church doesn't have a lot of trust, right? So again, what is our number one requirement from Scripture to be an overseer? Is to be above reproach. I think anything that looks like, smells like plagiarism keeps us from being above reproach. So again, I just think it's one of those things we talk to pastors about. There's no reason to do it. Go ahead and move on. It's going to cause more issues than it actually helps, right? But this is just a reminder. These things go on in our different circles. It's why we have these conversations, Jerry, because in a lot of our conversations, it's, hey, that doesn't happen at my church. Well, a lot of these systems, these things are around your church and a lot of other churches, a lot of churches that aren't mega churches. We've got to talk about them and come to some sort of conclusion about what we're going to do about each of these things at the church. Because again, plagiarism is going to cost you more trust than I think is worth it. And from my standpoint, just what's on your website, I think it's promoting plagiarism with us pastors. You're not plagiarizing, you're giving the work. But I think if they use it, especially as written, like it says, that's plagiarism.
Yeah, I just disagree, and I know these pastors. I know how difficult what they're doing is, and so I want to help them. And again, it's a nonprofit. It's we're not selling sermons. We're telling them, if you get this content together and you it really, our program is a whole church discipleship model. And so it requires so much energy and effort. Most of the churches quit before the 24 months is up, but it requires so much energy and effort. The majority of those churches that subscribe are bivocational pastors. Many of them, the pastor pays for it himself.
All right, let's look at a few more of these red flags. He says, I give him definitions. I give him Bible. I give him black and white facts with the definitions. And he just says, hey, again, I disagree. Doesn't say why he disagrees, doesn't give a factual reason for a misinterpretation of the facts of why he disagrees. He just says, hey, I disagree. I'm trying to help him. As long as I'm trying to help him, it can't be, plagiarism, right? He goes on to say, we're not selling them. And you saw on the screen, they very much so are selling them. This is a part of what they're selling, right? So it's a part of what they're selling. They're giving it a number value. I believe that is selling these things. But even if they were giving it away, they're saying it's okay for you to preach off of these sermons. Even if you're giving it away and even if it's helpful, that is still plagiarism, right? But because it's a good thing, he thinks it doesn't matter what the facts are, doesn't matter what we're saying, doesn't matter if it's by definition plagiarism. It's a good thing. It's helping these pastors, so it must be okay. And that is a dangerous, dangerous line of thinking. But again, this is a common response from narcissistic leaders or those who are showing narcissistic behavior. Because remember, again, one of the signs of narcissistic behavior that we talked about at the beginning is those exhibiting narcissistic behavior will ignore facts and opinions that contradict their own. So it doesn't matter how many facts I'm giving him here, he's going to ignore these, but the conversation has gotten a lot softer and a lot better. So I think that at least was a win.
My mentor told me when we developed this together, Dr. Owen Weston, he said, I want you to get this out there and sell it to pastors. And I said, there's no way I'd ever sell this. It's ridiculous. I won't sell anything. And he said, well, if you don't sell it, they'll never take it seriously enough. If they don't have any skin in the game, if they don't have something that forces them to really think about what they're doing. And I disagreed. I scholarshiped people, and he was right. I mean, they didn't do anything. When we started, I think it's about $100 a month is what they pay, something like that. And again, it goes to a nonprofit. We've given away free, cars to pastors who didn't have a vehicle, hospital bed to a pastor's wife who had throat cancer and needed an adjustable bed, given away over 100 vacations. That's a thing small church pastors tend to not be able to do. And the staff of my church will go, what I'll tell them is, if you'll take a vacation, including Sunday, because these small church pastors, they'll go like I did for years. I never missed one. I was 52 Sunday mornings, 52 Sunday nights every year. And I tell them, if you'll go, I'll send one of the people who lead worship at my church to lead worship for you. I'll send one of the people who preaches at my church to preach for you. And they won't need an honorarium, and I'll pay for you to go to vacation. So we've sent them over 100 either prayer retreats or vacations, depending on where they are. So I don't know. I feel like cherry picking that I'm offering sermons when the holistic of what that program is so incredibly valuable. And really that just gets to what my beef is, I guess, with much of what you do, Jeff, is like, there's this big, beautiful thing. 2040 Double is a really wonderful approach. It's helped so many churches and pastors find community. It's helped them, just make connections with other pastors. They just feel better, and their churches have grown in many cases. And then there's this little wart on the side of its face, and you're like, look at that wart right there. That's plagiarism. I just don't think that's fair. I guess that's my point.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not in any way trying to discount the good that you're doing with 24 to Double, because I believe that the heart is good. I believe you do want to help people. I'm sure there is good to it from everything that I've looked at. There looks like there probably is good to it, right? That doesn't discount the fact that there's still something there that needs to be addressed. And, although we don't want someone looking at the wart on our face, most of us, if we had a wart on the face, we'd go to the doctor and we'd say, hey, is this something that I could get removed? Is this okay? Right? And again, the disagreement, we get a lot of disagreement from pastors on plagiarism. That fits the definition of plagiarism: the use of another's work, words, or ideas without attribution. So I think the biggest argument...
me, if I could give a final word on that, I don't know where you got the definition. I don't care. I don't care who defines it that way. I'm just looking at pastors. I'm looking at pastors who have a calling on their life. They have sacrificed to be able to preach the gospel. They're frustrated. They don't know why it's not going well for them. 43% of pastors recently surveyed said they would do something else if they could. The divorce rate of pastors is higher than the divorce rate of their members. They don't have friends. Most pastors say they don't have one good personal friend. Like, there's so many problems with these pastors. And so you've identified one, tiny piece of a big holistic approach to bring those pastors into community, and try to help them. Many of those pastors, we've given them way more back in terms of, things we do to help them than their $99 a month or whatever the program costs right now. And so I don't really care if like the wording of that web page matches the Google search of plagiarism. Words matter. Language matters. How you say words matters. The words you say matter. So what I'm talking about is real life human beings that are struggling, and they're doing a noble thing, and I want to help them. So that's how I'm going to do that. So if that's what you want to call that's fine. I don't have any more arguments. I'm just telling you why I do what I do, and that's what I'm doing.
All right, guys, let's talk about these doozy red flag responses. The first one's a huge red flag for me. Jerry interrupts and says, well, hey, Jeff, if I could just get the final word on this. That's something that people who exhibit narcissistic behavior, they do a lot. He basically just said, I don't want to talk about this after this. I'm going to have the final word. I'm going to say whatever I want to say. And guys, they think that works. Of course, on this podcast, that doesn't work. We have conversations, and you don't get to just say, no, I'm going to have the final word because I don't want to talk about something anymore. But beyond that, he continues, and the next red flag is just as big. He says, I don't care if the definition of plagiarism says that. I don't care who says that. I don't care what anybody thinks. It's not plagiarism to me. And he doubles down on, I'm just trying to help people. Look at all these good things. Again, more deflection. I'm saying it's good. I'm just trying to help people. And he finishes this way. He says, so if that's plagiarism, and then stops and corrects it, because he was basically going to say, if it's plagiarism, I don't care. That's what I'm doing. But he stopped and he corrected it to this. If that's plagiarism, stop. If that's what you think plagiarism is, if that's what you're going to call plagiarism, then okay, whatever. I'm still going to do it. So he says, I'm still going to do it. And again, by saying if that's what you want to call plagiarism, he's questioning, he's invalidating the definitions that I've already given him. He's invalidating the meaning of the word, even though he said words matter and definitions matter earlier on in the conversation. Because guys, here's the deal. When you're dealing with narcissistic behavior, they can say things like words matter, but the truth is words only matter when they prove my point. Definitions only matter when they prove my point. If a definition or a word or a fact or any of those things contradicts my point, they don't matter anymore. Because again, it's about how they look. It's about keeping control. It's about spinning the narrative the way that they want to. And this is uncomfortable. I knew it would be uncomfortable. Plagiarism's uncomfortable. It's also something we've got to fix in the church. And I'm really tired of pastors saying it's okay and giving excuses for stealing other people's work, for using other people's work, for not putting in the work, for passing other people's work off as their own. All of that is plagiarism. So if you get into a conversation with someone and it gets to the point to where they say, I don't care what the definition is, I don't care what those facts were, I'm going to do this anyway, I'm going to believe it my way. When they do that, you're not going to help them. You're not going to change them. So again, there are some good things said in this conversation. There's a lot of things that were good. But at that point, I realized we're not going to have a conversation where I change this person's mind until he comes to grips with this behavior and says, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to repent of this behavior. I'm not going to do it anymore. Because until then, if you're going to deny the facts and you're going to refuse to believe no matter what we put in front of you, then it's just not a conducive conversation anymore, which is, why this is not going to be, a regular guest. Most of the pastors that we have interviewed, I'd interview again. Okay. Jerry's probably the only guest that I don't have any desire to talk with him again. And it's not because I'm mad at him. I don't have any desire to talk with him again because he's made it clear no matter what the facts are, no matter what we say, he's not willing to change his viewpoint. And that is heartbreaking. It's sad, but it's also the reality with some of these leaders. And that's why we have to expose these things. So not only can you see these troubling systems, you can see the problems with things like plagiarism, but also so that you can see the way narcissistic responses do damage in these situations. And guys, honestly, I'm not mad at him. I just feel sorry for him because if you can't look at the facts that I gave him and have a conversation to say, hey, this could be a concern, at least for some people, I can see why they'd be concerned. Then, man, yeah, I feel like you're in a bad place. You're just, you're really believing your own press clippings at that point. And again, I appreciate your desire to help. The reason why I bring it up, you started this conversation by saying that words matter. Words matter. Words have definitions. Okay. So when you look it up on Webster's, when you look it up in a dictionary of any kind, words have definitions. And according to the definition of plagiarism, that is plagiarism. So again, when we go through this with pastors, and we don't do this often, but when we go through this with different pastors, we always usually end up to this place where the argument usually ends up finishing on, well, maybe it's plagiarism, but it's okay for pastors. And it's like we're going to give pastors a pass to do something that in almost any other career field, people get fired over, right? I don't see how that's above reproach. And that tends to happen with churches. Another place that happens is finances. So let me ask you, this question about finances, because this is something we see and we push back on a lot. Does Daystar have open, detailed finances?
We do, yeah.
Okay.
The level of detail is determined by if you're a giver. So we publish an annual report every year that gives a lot of detail. It doesn't, obviously give every dollar. It does in big terms give every dollar. It doesn't break down every department. But we publish an annual report every year that's available for anybody. Anybody can see that. And then on rare occasions, people ask for more detail. We have an IRS auditor who's a member. He wanted more detail, so he came in and got more detail. So, yeah, it's pretty. I would call it pretty transparent.
Good. I'm glad that you guys offer that. Is there, like, when you talk about the annual report, How many line items is that? Like, we've seen annual reports that are 200 line items and show you all the big buckets of the budget. And then we've seen some, many that are 3, 4, and 5 line items. How many are you guys?
I don't know. We when we first started publishing it, it was a printed thing, and we made a big deal of it. It had lots and lots of lines. Nobody would pick it up. They were just bored. Nobody cared. So then we made it more, put it on a website. We made pictures and we shared more stories with it, try to gain more insight to it. So it's changed over the years in terms of how many line items. It's more of it's an integrated thing now. So it has lots of different what you would call a line item, but now they're encapsulated with a story of something that happened in missions, and then here's everything that came in for missions. A story that happened for student ministry, here's what came in there. And then there's like percentages, like this much goes to operations, this much goes to staffing, this much goes to facilities, this much goes to ministry budgets, this much. Here's the total amount. So you could, very easily see, if we spend 30% on staffing, 30% of this total budget, and of course, the website tells who works here and how many people. So like as much detail as you wanted, you could find out pretty much what people make, and a lot of detail.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys have that available. A lot of churches don't even have them available today. The norm is to have the pictures, the stories, and about 5, 6 line items. It's enough to know what the overall money is, but it's not really enough to know, where it's spent generally. Why is that? So you said we only give that to givers. That's something we run into a lot. Why is that not public? And I'm going to let you know the reason why I'm asking the question. From leading a nonprofit that every secular nonprofit that is not a church has to fill out a 990 form. And the 990 form goes into a lot more detail than most of these annual reports, a lot more detail about budget and how the money's spent. It also shows exactly how much money was made by anybody who's on the board of directors or in a high seat of influence. It also shows every single person, generally, or the top 5 earners, or everybody who makes over $100,000. There's a lot of different things there. So for any nonprofit that's not a church, what the CEO makes. And that's a part of what you're looking at, in addition to all of that other detail, to know, do I feel comfortable giving my donation here? So one, that's the reason why I'm asking, why is it not available on the website? But the second part of that question, why do you think churches operate less transparently financially than secular nonprofits? And what can we do about that so that we can be more transparent and people can have as much, if not more, trust in the church and how they're handling finances than other nonprofits?
Yeah. So just to clarify what we do and what I said is that that annual report that we publish is available to everyone. Anyone, you don't have to be a giver. It's available for everyone. But I said if people want more detail, then that's givers. We want givers to come and ask for more detail. And I don't know, there was a thing. It's been several years ago, but there was one of the major networks in the Birmingham market. I don't know, is it Fox News? They did this thing called Fox 6 on Your Side, and they were checking the top 10 largest churches in the Birmingham metro area and asking for financial breakdowns. And we were on that list. While we had a lot of people, we were really like our total budget was smaller than the salary budget of many of those other churches. But they came up, we sat down with them, gave them everything. We don't, my philosophy is always, the more information you hear about this church, the better you're going to like this church. So I want you to know more. I like it when people know stuff like that. But to the question of why churches are not as transparent, I would say a couple things. First of all, churches, where they come from, is just like highly disorganized in general. Like the people, this from being in ministry all those years, like the people who gravitate to ministry are people with the gift of mercy, hospitality. They have a pastoral care heart. They don't tend to be like organized, administratively gifted people. So in the sort of growth of churches out of small community neighborhood churches, where it comes from is just not super organized. Okay. Then as you get into larger churches that do have administratively gifted people running departments and things like that, they may not be asked for it very often. And then honestly, I think the way that a lot of churches are mistreated when people pick and choose details and share them out of context and tell outright lies makes churches a little gun shy sometimes. And then I guess a third reason why churches don't share that content is there's some of them are ashamed of stuff. They just don't want you to know how much they're spending on, whatever. And so there's definitely some of that as well.
What can we do? What can we do to overcome that shame and get it to a more transparent place? I'm a big believer that in everything we do, the church should be at a higher standard, operating at a higher standard than the world. I think that's one of the ways that we overcome all these things. We just turn the light on, because when the light's on, you can't hide as many things. So what can we do to get more financially transparent?
So early in my church tenure here, I told you we're pushing back on traditional church, and traditional church had this once a year business meeting where, if you're a giver, you could get information, and you have to be a member, and you come on a Wednesday night or whatever. And that's when we said, you know what, we're not going to do it that way. And so we had annual report Sunday. We passed out this report, had all these details, and we just started getting more transparent about things like that. We tell people details. That's just, again, I know what we do. I know what we do in our church, and we try to be responsive. If people ask for more, then we definitely give them more. But we've been very transparent with everything we do, and there's not really been any pushback. There's nobody saying, "Well, I want to know more about this," or "I want to know about that." So I think, to answer the question, what can we do? We can just, everybody should do that. Everybody should do that. You should be responsive to what people want to know. You should be transparent. First of all, you shouldn't do anything you don't want people to know about. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, I grew up in a really small Pentecostal church. I was pastored and raised by my mother, and her favorite scripture, I think, this is a little bit of a joke, but was, "All liars shall have their part in the lake of fire." So all my life, I was very aware that, God is not impressed with how good you can preach or sing or how many people you can get in the pews. You're going to stand before God based on your integrity. And so I just don't, there's no way I would say anything to you on this podcast to win an argument or to make your listeners like what I said. I don't care. I won't stand before Jeff. Jeff won't stand before Jerry. I won't stand before any of your viewers. I'll stand before a holy God who knows all this stuff anyways. So, I mean, just don't be a person who has anything to hide. I mean, that's the first step, I think. And pastors ought to be that. That ought to be who we are.
Agreed. We can't be above reproach if we're scared of people seeing, the details and stuff like that. It's part of being more transparent than the world, though. And this gets really uncomfortable when we talk about it with anybody. And I get that from, my history on church staff. But part of being more transparent than the world means we go to a greater standard than they do. And again, those 990 forms are publicly available. So I can look up any nonprofit in my area or across the country. And unless it's an association and a convention of a church, where they all of a sudden, as soon as they become an association and convention of a church, they no longer have to fill out those 990s because of separation of church and state. But they can, right? They can do that. So I can look up the annual salary of any CEO of any nonprofit. I can see how many people are making over $100,000. Would you guys be comfortable sharing that publicly, as a church? And why do you think so many of us aren't? I know personal finances and stuff get funny, but one of the greatest indicators of how a church is using their money, when you're thinking about how people are thinking about this in this day of, giga church pastors with private jets and stuff like that, is my pastor making a normal wage for my community and that sort of thing. So, would you guys be willing to do that? And what do you think keeps churches from wanting to do that?
So we don't disclose what anybody makes. That's, we feel like that's personal, and people, I'm not going to ask you what you make, and I don't tell you what I make or things like that. We do have we disclose how many people work at the church. We disclose what the total salary budget is. We disclose, what the total giving is. So it's easy to get an average, just do a little bit of math to get an average of what people make, but breaking down who makes what and how much is not something we've ever done before. I'll tell you how my salary is set. There's a third party outside of our church. It's an accounting firm that does that's a connection through the accounting firm that does our books, that does a salary review, and they say that the senior pastor should make in this range. And then a group of volunteers in the church who are the board of trustees, they set that salary range, and that's just kind of how that happens. And then they approve all salaries. They don't necessarily set every salary, but they approve them all. But they do set my salary, and that's how that's done.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fairly normal way, I think, of setting salaries, in the church world. That still usually happens by third party. The third party is not always as independent as that, so I appreciate that.
There's a problem with these. There's a problem with guys that are in sort of a loop of yes men, like I'm your oversight and you're my oversight. That's a problem with a lot of mega churches today, and salaries are arranged that way. And
agreed.
I don't like that. I don't believe that. I don't think there is a definite tension to having a guy who does HVAC overseeing his pastor. There's a tension there. We have that on our board. But I feel like for the sake of transparency and integrity, and I think that's necessary. And our church has really been, like, if you're looking for a scandal or you're looking some kind of gossip, it's a very, very boring church. Like, we just have not had anything to talk about. Like, there's just, for a church our size, and having been the pastor this is my 24th year. I mean, there is just very little to talk about. And I guess that's fundamentally where a lot of times, just my head can't wrap around the stuff that your channel is talking about, because I don't see that stuff. It's just not in my circle. I don't see these. I know there are scandals. I have no doubt about it, but I don't see broad scale. It's 350,000 churches in America, so you're absolutely going to have somebody who's a pedophile. You're going to have somebody who is a narcissist, and somebody who is just mistreating all their staff. I get all of that, but I just we haven't seen that stuff in our church, and I really don't see that in my circle. And I sometimes wonder if there's this feeling among people that subscribe to what you do, that if you're in a large church, then it's just this awful, terrible, mean, rude culture, and they're just back scratching, and it completely lacks integrity, and they're mistreating people, they're abusing people, and like we just not seen any of that in our church. And it really hurts my heart for people to think that. It's one thing to think that about me. Okay, I'm the guy on the stage, I get all the accolades, but like, the 25-year-old young man in my church who's just preached a few sermons, and he turned down a 4-year scholarship to go to a public school, a public university, came here, did his Bible college online, was an unpaid intern, and then he was a part-time intern, and then he finally got a full-time, and like he's 5 years into this thing, and he still, his salary is not great, but he just wants to preach the gospel. He wants to reach people. And but he just so happens to work at a quote mega church. Well, that's not at all like private jet flying. It's nothing like that language or NDAs or anything like that. So it just again, when those are all lumped together, I think it's unfair to some of the people that
Yeah.
serve so faithfully. And it's even more unfair, Jeff, I think, to like the people in the community who like might get the wrong impression from something on social media when what they really need is in that church. Like there's a small group leader. Like I'm not doing all this ministry. I'm leading an organization and I'm casting vision. I'm preaching the word. But the real ministry is the small group leaders that are just changing lives. I mean, they are mentoring people. They are picking people up in their most broken moments. And my fear is like one of those most broken people, they're just upset about everything. Their job mistreated them. Their dad abused them. Their boss mistreated them. They were mistreated by a coach in school, and they're looking for something. And then they're looking, churches do the same thing. And instead of going to that church and getting, what they really need and meeting Jesus, they make the wrong judgment about that church because they got a slanted view. And that's what I am afraid of with some of what's on social media.
Yeah, and I totally get that, man. But one of the things that that we consistently do is we talk about systems, right? So if you look at, we don't talk just about the mega church. I think that's the stuff that tends to come across your feed because that's the stuff that you're interested in because you're a mega church pastor. But the episode that we aired on Monday, we talked with a mega church pastor about how the mega church was, and we're talking a top 10 type mega church, right? Top 10 type giga church. I don't know exactly what their attendance is, but it's large. How he found healing in the mega church, but he experiences abuse in small churches, right? So we talk about it on all sides, but systemically, there are systems that are affecting the churches that predominantly the churches that over half of Americans are attending. And these are the things that we talk about, right? So I hear you that your church is doing a lot of good things, and I agree. I echo your church is doing a lot of good things. But just to recap, this is why we want to have these conversations, because to say, hey, they're doing it, but we're not doing it, it's probably not everybody. I don't want us to talk about it a ton. I have not had an answer to the plagiarism question yet that was much different than yours. So one of the red flags we look at is, how does a church view plagiarism? Because we think it leads down a slippery slope. If you can justify that, you can justify other things, right? Doesn't mean you're going to, doesn't mean you have, you just can. We look at finances. Is a church voluntarily more transparent than a 990, or at least as transparent as a 990? Or are they hiding things or not sharing things that those would share, right? So I've asked you the same question. And although there's a lot of good of things that you guys are doing with your finances, it's still much less transparent than a 990. So if you get one or two bad actors into a system like that, then it can really turn things sour. And it's not always the senior pastor who's doing the spiritual abuse. A lot of times it's the people that, they're delegating a lot of the ministry to as well. We talked about NDAs, and if you got, if you got a few more minutes, I'd love to do a little bit of a lightning round, after
Yeah,
that. If not, that's okay.
Yeah, no, I'm fine for about 7 minutes. About
Okay.
7 more minutes.
So you and I have disagreed a lot on NDAs. NDAs are used, from all the data that I can see, they're used, or at least, people have thought about using them in well over half of evangelical churches. Like the National Association for Evangelical Churches has written articles on this. We've talked to attorneys on this. You guys say you don't use NDAs, which I appreciate. But what are your thoughts? Just, should a church use an NDA that tells people they can't say anything negative about the church that they were at in order to receive a severance or a hush money payment to a volunteer or something like that? Do you see any?
Yeah, we don't use NDAs. I don't know of a church that does. I'm in relationship with hundreds of churches. I've never known a church that used an NDA. I worked at a few churches in a support role, never was given an NDA. So I don't doubt your research, so I'm sure they do that. What I want when someone leaves our staff, and we do have a conversation about it, is for them to think holistically about the good the church has done and not to do anything to undermine the good that the church has done. I've never and would never ask somebody to lie. That's completely so far off the radar. I can't imagine someone goes into ministry. It doesn't make any sense to me. If you're capable of building this mega church and becoming super famous and becoming a millionaire through that, you should just do something else. Because why be a pastor if you're going to be a liar? I can't get that. It doesn't compute in my brain. I don't lie. I've never told anyone to lie. Can't say I've never lied. I don't remember the last time I lied. It was a really, really long time ago. When someone leaves our church, our church staff, first of all, a lot of them stay. Like, man, my last worship pastor led worship 6 Easter services for me as a volunteer. We just have good relationships with them. But what we just ask them is, you know a lot of stuff about the church. I mentioned that, like, the reason I need to leave in 7 minutes is because my iPad is dead and I can't text my assistant to go pick up my kid from basketball. And it's rare that my assistant does something just personal for me. But, like in an occasion like this, I would normally finish up this podcast with you and she would go 3 miles to pick him up, and I'll probably hand her $20 for gas out of my pocket. Okay. But if she, for whatever reason, quit the church and then she was out there telling people, well, I just couldn't work where my job was just carting the pastor's son around. Well, she did occasionally, maybe one time a month, cart my kids somewhere because I was engaged in ministry. But that's not fair. It's not a fair statement. And we don't ask her to sign a document where she won't say that. We don't hold back her severance package if she says something like that. We've never done that. But I would tell, in fact, when I hired her, I told her, you're going to work really closely with me. And if you like nitpick small pieces of what I do, it could be taken out of context. So I want you to understand, you want to be fair when you talk to your friends about what you do. I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that lacks integrity. And that's the way we handle those kind of things.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that you guys don't do NDAs. That's a breath of fresh air. Normally you and I've had enough conversation before we even started. I didn't feel like I needed to ask the pressing questions because a lot of times we don't do NDAs. We ask pressing questions and find out they are using NDAs because a single non-disparagement clause, a single confidentiality clause, those are the things that make it an NDA, even when it's not called that. So they get snuck into severance agreements, stuff like that all the time. And I appreciate the fact that you guys don't do that. I want to give you props for that because that is becoming exceedingly rare. And I really appreciate your integrity there. A couple of other questions. Multi-site's become all the rage. I was a small groups pastor in a mega site, multi-site mega church. Small groups don't take the place of pastoral care and discipleship. They can fill in some of that void. They don't take care of all of that. And when the larger you get, the leaner a church tends to run on staffing. So you have less pastors for the same amount of people. Why do you think, and why did you guys choose to go multi-site versus church planting?
We do both. So we've planted 4 churches in those 20 plus years that I've been in ministry here. We've planted 4 churches and we've launched.
Those local or international?
Internationally we've launched over 200, but locally we've launched 4. Okay. So one in Alabama, one in Tennessee, one in Georgia, and one in Texas. Those churches are doing well. One of them is not yet launched yet, but they're out there and they're doing their small group meetings. So we believe in both. And God spoke to me, and I don't say this a whole lot because I'm really skeptical of my own righteousness and yours. So like all these guys that are talking about God said, I don't say that a lot. But one thing I know God said to me was, Jerry, you'll find your dreams on the other side of your staff members' dreams. If you will focus on helping them reach their dreams, you will naturally find your own. And so I made that change. And so when a pastor on my team wants to be a campus pastor, we start talking about how we could launch the next campus if he's capable. And if one says, I want to be a church planter, we start talking about how we could launch the next church. If one says, I want to be a missionary, we start talking about how we could raise money for that. And I just really believe that, God speaks to a lot of people. I'm not the only one God's speaking to, and it's not just my dream that matters, and it's not just the vision of the house that matters. There's a lot of vision. So that's how we came about both. The reason I like the multi-site thing for now, I don't know that we'll do it forever, is what you said. It does allow us to focus more ministry resources. We do more for missions than most any church you'll ever meet. I can say that with confidence. And one of the reasons we do that is we do have a lean staff. And I'll push back a little bit. I think some of the best pastoral work that is done in our church is done by small group leaders. They're well trained. We pastor those pastors as they pastor their 10-member flock. That doesn't mean we close the door on others. If anybody wants to meet with me, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. It may not be today. It won't be today, probably, but the answer is always yes. If you ask my assistant, can I meet with the senior pastor? Yes. Now, when? That might be a month out, but you can meet with somebody today. Are you in a small group? Have you need to join a small group in the meantime? Can I get you to meet with one of our assistant pastors? So we don't stop doing that. But I will say this, Jeff, man, I don't know that I knew this was going to be the case when we started small groups, but as a veteran of it, I do believe the best ministry that happens in our church happens in small groups. People find a job, people get off drugs, their marriages get healed. I mean, some of the most amazing things happen in those small groups. And so I really believe that's pastoral care.
Yeah, I think a lot of good things happen in small groups, a great community, great ministry. From my experience, not only as a, pastor, but as a church consultant, the majority of small group leaders I see nobody ever asks the question, are they called, gifted, and equipped to be a pastor? And we don't give them training as a pastor, or theological training for the sake of, discipleship, because of course discipleship can't happen, one meeting, a week, or, 2 meetings a month or whatnot. So I think there's a lot of good things. I love small groups. My concern is just that they don't take the place of life on life discipleship, like what Jesus was talking about in the Great Commission. Because the first century view, and we're doing a video on that soon, but the first century view of discipleship, we've lost a lot of that because it's just so different, from the Western view. But anyway, Jerry, I appreciate you coming on. I know, again, we don't always agree, and we had a heated exchange in the middle. And, I hope that we both learned something today. I hope that we both gotten a little bit better. I still am grateful for you and the work that you do, even when I don't agree. Again, I've heard great things about Daystar, so thank you for being a light in those areas. My only encouragement, would be to, to continue to learn, which you've said that you're doing, continue to learn and not default to defensiveness, but default to learn, because the gravitational pull of a lot of these systems, including ARC systems, which it looks like you guys are using some ARC system names and stuff like that. The gravitational pull is to do things a different way than, what you described as your heart, to do them. We want more churches to be able to say, hey, we're doing these things above reproach, and we're standing with that. But again, I appreciate the candidness, of the conversation. I think there's a lot that we're probably still going to disagree on. Hopefully there's a little bit more that we agree on. But again, thank you for being willing to do this, because not every pastor is willing to have these conversations. Is there anything that you want to share with the person who has been hurt before you leave? Anything you want to share with the person who's been hurt, who is literally getting sick when they try to go back to church? They want to disengage, but they are struggling, or they want to re-engage, but they're struggling. What would you say to them? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would say that a couple things are really important. The local church and finding a local church is very important. Jesus, this westernized world we live in today is so individualistic, and we don't really realize that the Bible was written and the church was established in a completely group dynamic. And so you'll never quite be able to, I'm not saying you can't know Jesus by yourself, but the idea of just me and God, I'm going to be with God and away from the people. While that sentiment is very understandable, it's just not biblical, and you'll never get the best out of the church, out of God, and your relationship with God apart from the church. So then that creates a problem if you've been hurt by the church. And so then the other thing I would say is to find one person. One of the things we like to say here at Daystar among our staff is that we'll do for one what we wish we could do for all. And so we often challenge our staff and members to find that one person that is far from the church. They may be close to God, they may be close to us, but they're far from the church. And connect with them and have those conversations and help them reintegrate into a faith family. That might be a Christian counselor, a therapist. It might be a Christian down the street, could be a pastor. But God has not given up on you. He is committed to building his church, and he wants you to be a part of that. The last thing I would just say is that I'm sorry for your pain, that I see you. I realize that you're not alone in that, and you didn't deserve that hurt that happened to you. There's nothing you did that made it happen. And that's not a reflection on God or his church, toward his church, the capital C church. It may be a reflection on so-and-so church in your neighborhood, but not God's church. God's church is a loving place, and you can find that and be a part of that and be a part of the solution. So I pray and hope that you're able to find that and find the fulfillment God has for you.
Yeah, man, I appreciate that so much. And Jerry, thank you again, for your time today. Thank you for being willing to deal into an uncomfortable conversation at times, and one that we knew could be potentially uncomfortable. But again, guys, I hope you have learned from this. If nothing else, we don't always agree. We're not going to always agree with everybody, especially in this, contentious election season. But there's something powerful. It is hard to hate someone when you get eye to eye and knee to knee with them, even if you disagree with them. So, before we argue on social media, find someone that you can get eye to eye with and have a tough conversation. That's going to make us better. I think that's part of the kingdom. So I hope that you have learned something from today. I hope that this has been encouraging to you in at least some way. I hope it's made you think. You may not agree with me on everything that I've said. You may agree more with Jerry on certain places, and that's okay. But I hope it's helped you to think deeper and broader about the church. All right, guys, so there you have it. That's normally where we leave it, but I wanted to land the plane on this one and really just say a couple of things. One, I hope this wasn't too hard on you. I know, again, for different people with certain triggers, this is a really tough conversation. Could be really triggering. So I hope this one was okay for you, and that you learned something from it. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this one, this is a very hard conversation, and to be totally candid, I thought about not posting it multiple times, not because I was ashamed. Again, I've owned up to, since we recorded this, I've said, hey, I got too angry. I let my anger get the best of me, and I need to repent for that in a conversation. So it wasn't embarrassment about that. One, I didn't want Jerry to feel like I was attacking him, and I know he's not going to be happy with, the way that this was done, the things that I've called out. But at the same time, the reason why I did this was triggering for me when I did it. It was triggering for me to edit. It has taken over a month for me to edit, guys, because it's brought up a lot of things. It's been a struggle. This is not as easy of one as I would like to do. So there were all kinds of reasons not to do it. Here's why we did it. I did it because until we learn how to call out these narcissistic behaviors, we're never going to know how to deal with them. We're never going to know how to recognize them. And what better way to recognize them than in real life? So I know if this one triggered me the way that it did, how much worse is it going to be when you experience behaviors like this in a church setting with your pastor or one of your church leaders, someone who has authority and spiritual authority over you? How much more is it going to make a difference when this is your boss, right? So I felt like we needed to do this, and that this may be one of the most important episodes we ever did, because it takes these narcissistic behaviors, narcissistic responses, narcissistic conversations. It takes them from theory, like when we talk to people like Chelsea Brooke Cole, and it really shows them in real life. And you see, hey, sometimes these things don't feel super bad in a vacuum, but the way that they all build on each other, it can really turn into a damaging conversation. And that's also, guys, this is why we work so hard with churches and things like our church safe assessments and helping train their staffs on trauma-informed care. Because when you are trauma-informed, you recognize how saying certain things, like some of the things that Jerry said, how they can re-traumatize hurt and broken people. And again, it's just one of those things. There's so many people who are walking into our churches with trauma. We owe it to ourselves and we owe it to them to understand how our own responses, even when we don't mean these things to be bad, negatively affect people. So I hope this has helped you. I know it wasn't easy, but I hope that it has helped you. And if there's any way that we can support you and encourage you after this one, you have questions, you just need some prayer, we want to walk through that with you, because this may have opened up some things that you weren't planning on this episode opening up. But we'll be back next week with normal conversations and normal interviews that are not nearly as triggering and frustrating. These are going to be back to our kind of normal style interviews. We got a lot of good stuff coming up. But again, I want to finish this way. I am not angry at Jerry Lawson. I don't think Jerry Lawson is a bad guy. I don't think he's a bad pastor. I don't think Daystar is a bad church. I just think the narcissistic responses that he has learned and picked up are much more dangerous than he realizes. I think they're more damaging than he realizes. And I think there are a lot of churches like Daystar and a lot of pastors like Jerry that say, hey, all these abuses, the spiritual abuse, these scandals, all that stuff, that's not us. And I would agree with them. It's not you. My fear is there's a lot of them, though, that are playing with fire with a lot of the same systems and not understanding how to deal with people who have been traumatized, not understanding, above reproach, not willing to draw hard lines about things like plagiarism. And my fear is that if we don't have more churches talk about these things and deal with these things before they become spiritual abuse, before they become scandal, that we're headed in the same direction. But I really am grateful for Jerry. I'm grateful that he was willing to have a tough conversation. Guys, this is hard. Saying yes to a conversation like this is very, very hard. Now, it could have went a lot better if he didn't push it the way that he pushed it. I hate that it went that way, right? But at the end of the day, I am not mad at Jerry or Daystar. I am praying for them because he's right. There's a lot of good that's going on at his church. There's a lot of good in him. And if they'll look at some of these systems, if they'll commit to being above reproach, and if they'll commit to things like becoming trauma-informed, and they'll commit to fighting against narcissistic behaviors in their culture, churches like Daystar could do so many more incredible things than they've done already. But I hope to leave you with this. We can recognize narcissistic behaviors. We can say, hey, these are not okay. They are not going to fly. That is not Jesus. We can say that and still love people, still value people. And I never want to devalue someone. I never want to dehumanize someone. Whenever possible, we want to fight to not leave upset and angry and looking for revenge, on people who do these things to us. We want to pray for them. We want to pray for them because I know if it wasn't for the work that God has done in me, I very naturally can run into these same responses. I've done it before. I could do it again. So my prayer is that the Holy Spirit will begin teaching and convicting Jerry of some of the same things that he taught me and convicted me of to help me recognize those things in myself. And if you're in a place where you can, and I know you're not, everybody's not, but if you're in a place where you can, would you join me in praying for the people who have done some of these things to you? Would you pray for those people who don't recognize the narcissistic behavior in their own lives? At the same time, while it's okay, while we shouldn't dehumanize them and we should pray for them if we can, if you're in a situation with someone showing narcissistic behaviors and they won't respect your boundaries, they won't stop, it is okay to love them. It's okay to care for them, to pray for them, and not be around them as long as they continue that behavior. Your safety, your mental health, your spiritual well-being, it's got to come first, all right? So I'm praying for you guys. I love you. We'll be back next week with a much more normal episode. Until then, grace and peace. We'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.